Okay, ladies and gentlemen, there's the feedback. Please have your seats. We're about to commence or recommence. While you're doing that, I have one announcement. A mobile phone was found, and you can get it back at the registration. It's a Samsung. So if anyone is missing his or her mobile phone, you can either ignore the fact that you lost it and be happy for the rest of your life, or go and ask for it again. Right. Could I ask the people in the tables in the back, either join us up here in the front. Please come to the front and continue the conversations after the keynote, because it's quite loud here on stage. Okay, so I promised you this morning it would be a long day, and guess what? I was right. It is a long day, but staying here for the last session of the day is also worth it, because we have a wonderful guest all the way from the East Coast of the United States, from Connecticut, Susan Gregg. She's here to join us. She's the vice president at an organization called EDUCAUSE, a professional association with a mission to advance higher education through the use of information technology. So she's probably best placed to address you here tonight, to talk to you about the grand challenges that she sees. Maybe as a background, I won't tell you what I found out just recently when we discuss what you really like and what you would love to buy in Berlin. I will leave that between us. But I can tell you that Susan got her PhD from Yale University, and she worked for 25 years at that institution in various management and leadership positions in the IT field. So not only does she now represent an association that is dealing with the topic of IT in higher education, she also has the professional background to match that. And so I won't take any more of your time now and ask Susan to join me here on stage to do her keynote. We'll do a bit similar like with Professor Pellet earlier this morning. So she'll have about roughly half an hour, and then we'll fill the other half an hour with questions from your side. So again, please take note of your questions, put them down so that you're well prepared once we're starting with Q&A time. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to come here to talk with you and to learn from you. To learn from you, because I always learn when I talk with people, when I hear the questions, when I see the reactions. And so I look forward to a very healthy and interesting dialogue after my formal presentation has ended. And I look forward, maybe as much as you do, to the cocktail hour that is coming right after. And with that in mind, I will be expeditious. The one other thing I'd like to say before I start my talk is that normally my rule is not to have you think about the presenter, but to have you think about the presentation. However, today I'm going to break that rule briefly, because you may be wondering why I am wearing these ugly white shoes. And it is not a fashion statement, I can assure you of that. I'm recovering from a broken foot. However, that's also actually very useful. The American artist Norman Rockwell would say when a painting wasn't going well, he always put a dog in the painting. And when it really wasn't going well, he put a bandage on the dog. So if my talk really isn't going well, you can always look at my feet, at my poor bandaged foot, and you can say, that poor woman, and you can still retain a little bit of sympathy for me. All right. I'm going to talk about grand strategy for grand challenges, and to think about this as a way to approach the digital transformation in higher education. An overview. One of the things I'll start with is I'm going to talk about the grand challenges that are facing higher education and the imperative that we address those challenges. Then I will talk a little bit about a grand strategy approach and take the concept of grand strategy from the political military world and think about applying that to higher education. Why should we think about applying that? Well, grand strategy is in essence a vision for your plan. So all of our institutions very often have visions, vision statements about what is the mission of the institution. You can think of a grand strategy as a vision for how the institution achieves its mission. And then I will start thinking about grand principles that best fit digital transformation of grand principles that we are considering related to digital transformation. And then we'll talk about how digital transformation can be applied to achieve your grand strategy to address grand challenges. So it's first very helpful to think about definitions when we are talking about highly abstract concepts and emergent concepts. And I'd like to start with the definition of digital transformation that EDUCAUSE, my organization, has developed in collaboration and working very closely with leaders in information technology and higher education. First thing I'm going to start with is when I've given a talk about digital transformation before, I've started and I've asked the audience available technology. And for all of these, I would say either no or not quite. So let's think for a minute about these definitions and ask yourself whether these definitions are uses of information technology to achieve the grand challenges of higher education. In interviews that we have done with institutional presidents and provosts, rectors and chancellors of higher education, when we ask them, what are your top priorities independent of information technology? What are your top priorities? You can see this is what they said. They said, well, we're reinventing our general education curriculum. We are really hoping to external sources, not just other institutions. We're actually thinking through the future of work and how we should respond to that. And then very, very fear-based with climate change, a major earthquake would put us out of business. Another hurricane, we're not sure we could survive. These are leaders' top priorities. So our definition of digital transformation is trying to help leaders in higher education, colleges and universities, to achieve their institutional outcomes that they're looking for. So what we're talking about is how do we optimize and transform the institution's operations, strategic directions, and value propositions through deep and coordinated shifts in culture, workforce, and technology. Because again, digital transformation, you think about technology, don't you? But we know that for any meaningful and widespread change in technology, it's not just about technology. Hence the culture and the workforce. Let me continue the definition for a minute, because sometimes it's helpful to really understand what something is when you think about what it is not. So I'm going to talk about three concepts: digital transformation, but also digital analog state to digital state, scanning things, digitizing records, etc. And we have been doing that for decades, and we are still doing it. Then there's digitalization, and you could think of digitalization as digitizing processes. So you get those data digitized, and then you start to use them. They interact with each other, they interact with people. And then digital transformation. So digital transformation is not digitalization, it's not digitization, but it is often confused for those. And just to see how we think of this as an arc, digitization has two steps. There is simply digitizing the information, and then there's bringing it together and organizing it. With digitalization, you automate the processes, and then you streamline the processes by applying business process transformation and the like. And then digital transformation is not about the data or the processes, it's about the business model, it's about the institution. Here's an example with digitization. You might digitize paper records so that you can archive them and retrieve them. Then you might extract metadata about those records so that you can manage them more effectively. Then you might take processes and start to move those data, maybe via electronic forms for input, so that you can improve the accuracy and the efficiency. And then you start to bring processes together so that you can optimize efficiency and start to automate things. But digital transformation is not like those other things at all. With digital transformation, you might develop an enterprise digital strategy. And maybe it's for teaching and learning, maybe it's for research, maybe it's for administering the institution that would use digital technologies and really scale innovation in a way that is aligned with your business goals. Here is a visual definition of digital transformation being driven by many external and internal factors, including advances in technology, really most notably in storage and network capacity, in what we can do now with data and how we can apply it with analytics and AI and machine learning, but also by changing expectations of students, of employers. They want something different from higher education, whether we like it or not. They need something different. And they want something different from their educational experience and their educational outcomes. Then funding cuts, at least in the United States, but I think we're seeing more and more of that in Europe as well. My own home state, Connecticut, we're the wealthiest state in the United States. Not because everybody in Connecticut is rich, mind you, but because we have an awful lot of rich people, mostly in finance, who live in our state. The wealthiest state in the nation, and yet we have made the decision over the next 5 years to reduce state funding for higher education in Connecticut by a total of 25%. And that is the reality that we live in the United States, much to my shame. Then we have the process of digital transformation of culture, workforce, and technology. And I'll give you a quick example of that at the end of the talk. And then the outcomes, in order to achieve particular outcomes. And these are pretty big, ambitious outcomes, and we wouldn't be calling it digital transformation in scale. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of articles. You can go to Google and you can Google EDUCAUSE digital transformation. These slides will be available to the speaker, so we'll make sure that these slides are available to you so that you can actually get these slides and download them. But this describes our definition of digital transformation in greater detail. And then for those of you who don't like to read long, wordy documents, we've created a little short version of that digital transformation, our signals document that's organized in checklist form so that you can really sit there and think to yourself bit by bit, how is my institution doing? And where might we need to learn? So we've got these great outcomes, teaching and learning, research, the business model of the institution, improve student outcomes. Well, how will you achieve those outcomes? Do you have a grand strategy? So, grand strategy takes an approach and thinks first about what are our grand challenges, our difficult but important problems. I'll talk a little bit more about higher education's grand challenges in a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about the process of of grand strategy. Grand strategy, as I said, is kind of a vision statement to describe the ends and means that you're going to use to achieve your grand challenges. So a vision statement for your plan. And then it goes into a little bit more detail, describing the grand plans, a little bit more detail, and then grand behavior, which is that how you're going to actually do exactly what you're going to do. Most of what we do when we decide what we're going to do and what our plans are is we're practical people, right? We're concrete people. So we usually jump right to the grand behavior. Well, We're going to invest in mobilization. We're going to use AI to transform the way we teach. We're going to apply business process transformation at scale. And we skip right over why and what will it achieve us, and is that really the right investment? Because we have to make choices. So, example of grand strategy, and it's interesting that I'm giving this talk here in Germany, here in Berlin, but I told you that grand strategy, I really drew that from military political theory, and I first thought about this, and I didn't connect this to digital transformation for several years later, but you know, I was a student at Yale. My niece was a student at Yale just a few years ago. And she lives in Arizona, but she moved to Connecticut, and we spent a lot of time. I was kind of her mom away from home while she was here. And she was taking a grand strategy course. And I thought, that's so interesting. I don't think they had that when I was a student, and indeed they didn't, but they talked about grand strategy. So I learned a little bit about it from her and was very interested in it. And that gave me the kernel of an idea to apply it. So grand strategy is really integrating all of the inputs and the outputs, thinking about what are the interests, threats, resources, and policies that are available, in this case, to a country, right? Or to a group of countries, to an alliance. And then think of it as the theory or logic that guides leaders when they're really trying to navigate their way and find a path through to security in a very unstable and insecure world. It's long-term in vision, and it's holistic as it thinks through all of the various instruments available. And I thought this really could apply to where higher education is today. So let me give you an example, the US Cold War. Congratulations on the 30th anniversary of the wall coming down. Many, many congratulations. So if you don't mind, though, we're going to go back to the US Cold War. And I'm going to talk through the elements of grand strategy with that as an example. So the grand principle that the United States, with its allies, came upon to try to contain communism was containment. A grand principle. And it's describing the ends and the means in very grand ways. They could have come up with some other choice for what to do about the threat of communism and the spread of communism. They might have sought for an alliance. They might have sought for direct confrontation all the time. But the solution, the grand principle, was containment. So what were the grand plans? What's an example of grand plans that would follow the grand principle of containment? In the United States, the NSC, or National Security Document number 68, describes these plans for a containment strategy in greater detail. And then there's grand behavior. So those are the plans, but what's actually an example? An example would be the Korean War. Forced confrontation only when necessary. The United States deemed it necessary. We could certainly argue with that. And the Korean War was a result. You might think of the Berlin Wall perhaps as an example of a literal example of containment from the Soviet Union. This, again, when I saw this quote, I thought of higher education. So this is in the military context, but this, to me, describes universities so very well. Without a clear strategy statement, the next president, you could think of the university, will fail to set a foreign policy course that leverages resources and allies and escape the damaging tendency to do a little everywhere and seek to stamp out fires wherever they burn. And I've seen that so often in colleges and universities in the United States. Well, everything's a priority. Well, if everything's a priority, nothing is, right? And it's difficult to make good investments. So let's apply grand strategy for a moment to higher education. Again, another quote. As I said, grand strategy is much closer to a vision statement than a blueprint. It really is saying we're going to develop a vision statement for our plan at a very high level so that as we learn more, as circumstances can change, this will be the guiding vision that will guide our choices. because we have so many and so few resources. Well, grant strategy needs to change when the ecosystem changes, when the environment changes. So applying this at least to higher education in the US, and I leave it to you to tell me what has changed in Europe and in Germany. But this little word cloud used to describe the higher education ecosystem. Certainly when I grew up in it and when I worked and taught in it. We thought when you said higher education to somebody, they thought, well, somebody, you know, in their early 20s, it's affordable. It's a public good. I work with professors and I get degrees and I live on the campus. Well, now here's a word cloud that could describe today's higher education environment. Again, at least in the United States. And again, I leave it to you to think about what your word cloud would be for your country. But now, debt. Higher education is expensive, and the costs have grown far out of proportion. My example of my state's choices are a good example of partly why it's not affordable. Students worry about debt. They want a job. They don't just want to learn. They don't want to learn how to think. They want a job when they graduate, and they make this big investment. They are thinking more of credentials, and they're much more open to credentials besides a higher education 2 or 4-year degree or graduate degree. They want a practical credential. They might be happy with a credential for, say, 20 credits of study or something like that. They want a credential. They want to gain real skills. They're thinking about lifelong learning. Right? So Harvard University pioneered this concept of the 60-year curriculum, really recognizing that it's no longer viable to think about higher education as a 4 or 6-year investment that you make at the very start of your adulthood, but that you will need to be re-educated again and again. And why should colleges and universities leave that opportunity to employers or simply to individual learners? And there are other issues. We think about the whole student, the full student. In the US, we're seeing a real crisis in mental health. And people who work at universities and teach in universities say that the mental health, the anxiety, depression rates that they're seeing in students are just unprecedentedly high compared to even 10 years ago. So another point about grant strategy is that it takes an ecosystem approach. This is not just what your individual institution is going to do about this, but you're really thinking about the institution in conjunction with the overall ecosystem, the circumstances of other institutions, but also national and international institutions and their interplay with one another. How will your institution thrive in relation to the larger ecosystem, and how will it interact with it? Then how will the institution help advance the ecosystem, not just itself? Grant strategy is long-term, really thinking about where are we headed, not just for the next 2 or 3 years, but what is higher education going to look like in 2035 and beyond, and what do we need to do to prepare for it? What kind of an institution do we want to be? It is, as I said, a guiding intellectual framework. It doesn't tell you the grand behaviors you choose, but it helps you guide and prioritize. It enables you to lean into difficult trade-offs and to make your priorities explicit. Well, does this really fit our grand strategy? I know that we want to do it. I know it seems exciting. What a great opportunity. But it doesn't really fit with our grand strategy. I'm afraid that we should say no to this one, which is difficult and yet really empowering once you really think about it that way. And then it helps you translate those big objectives into clear, grand behaviors. So I told you I would talk about grand challenges. I showed you some of the grand challenges of higher education a few minutes ago, but let's talk about the concept of grand challenges, because again, It's not that I'm fond of using the word grand. It's not that I'm a grandiose thinker, but this is actually just like grand strategy. Grand challenges is a term of art that I thought might apply to where higher education is today. Grand challenges are really attempts to solve problems that are massive, that are massively difficult, that apply to the whole ecosystem, that require ongoing learning and experimentation, because we don't have a blueprint for them, and that are intentionally energizing and motivating, to motivate the public, to motivate funders, politicians, but also the local ecosystem. And with grand challenges, it's really about the community coming together to collectively develop a sense of what the possibilities are, to learn, to understand the risks, and to learn at least as much about the risks as about the solutions, and to maintain that urgency, that sense of urgency. A couple of examples of grand challenges drawn from the United States. The U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy introduced a grand challenge in the late 1980s, and the grand challenge was really a challenge to the field, accompanied by funding from the U.S. government, to try to develop an infrastructure and resources for high-performance computing, to enable the use of research with high-performance computing. And you can see where high-performance computing has had an enormous amount of success. And part of that was spurred by that collective call to action and coordination of a grand challenge. The National Science Foundation now has 10 big ideas. So this is our version of grand challenges today. If you were to Google NSF 10 big ideas, you would see this list. And you can see that these are pretty big ideas, whether it's quantum leap and really trying to develop quantum computing and practical applications, understanding life, and DNA and bioengineering and the like, windows on the universe, the future of work, et cetera. I wish I could tell you that the funding behind these big ideas was terribly grand, and it isn't, but that's where we find ourselves today. But at least they're trying to initiate a call to action and collective action. So I had talked to you about grand challenges for higher education, and I just want to talk a little bit more about these grand challenges for higher education. Let me just make sure. Okay, good. Let's see. I have a longer version of this talk where I go into more detail, and I wanted to make sure that I was to stay on this slide. So as I said, we interviewed about 24 universities leaders, and we asked them, what are your most pressing priorities, and what are you focused on, both today, but also in the near term, within the next 18 months to 2 years? They talked about these 4 different areas. We collectively sorted their challenges into these 4 different areas. With student success, which is, I think, more of a focus in the United States, probably because of funding in part. But they talked about trying to get student outcomes in a both very specific way for them to get degrees and credentials, for them to get jobs, but also thinking about what kind of students we're preparing. They talked about engagement and how they can really keep the students engaged in their learning journey and at the institution, because students are expecting levels of engagement that they get in the consumerized world, right, from their higher education digital experience. And so here's the consumerized world and the experience that it offers digitally, and maybe here's higher education very often. But these are the criteria that they're applying. And then they talked just about very specific institution-based student success, persistence, retention, completion. Financial health. A number of seemingly disparate topics came up under financial health, but when leaders talked about financial health, they really talked, or when they talked about enrollment, when they talked about natural disasters, they were really talking at the bottom line about the financial sustainability and success of the institution. And then reputation and relevance. This is something that many institutions used to be able to take for granted. Many universities used to be able to take for granted. Are we affordable? What's the quality of our teaching? How are our academic programs stacking up? And what about our research? And then something really rather new in the United States, and that's the political climate. And do we have a political climate that is supportive of or hostile to higher education? What about the political climate and for the United States, the impact of our ability to draw international students? And since the trade war with China, we have really seen attendance and enrollment of Chinese students plummet at our institutions. And that's a big deal. And then finally, something else that's really relatively new in higher education, and that's external competition. And by that, I don't mean Yale competing with Harvard or Princeton. What I mean is Yale competing with Microsoft or other employers, other degree providers and the like, other credential providers, right? As I said, students are becoming less and less attached to a bachelor's degree or a master's degree because as they become more focused on a job, that certificate that they might hang on the wall means less than that paycheck that they deposit in their bank account. And then really thinking of higher education at a global level and recognizing that there are other sources of education, other sources of learning than just those that reside in the United States. So how do we think about grand strategy for higher education? And didn't I tell you I was going to talk about digital transformation? Where the heck is that? Why haven't I spoken about that? So we've got these grand challenges for higher education. Which of these are yours? Do any of these apply to you? Anybody want to raise their hand? And if none of these apply to you? Okay. That way, I knew you wouldn't have to take action if you didn't want to. So I hate it when a speaker asks me to raise my hand and I'm sitting there and just enjoying the flow of the talk. Okay, let's think about thinking about a grand strategy in relation not just to the challenges, but a little bit more thoughtfully about what are your circumstances as an institution. So, you know, this nice little 2x2 4-quadrant matrix, which is used all over the place, right? But in this case, the 2x2 is, does your institution need to focus more on overcoming its weaknesses? Or do you have strengths that you really want to build on? Of course, it's not an either or, but you could sort of probably plot and say, you know, overall, we're pretty good. We've got some problems, but we can maximize our strengths, or we can't even think about maximizing our strengths because foundationally, we've got some big weaknesses to overcome. So there's that. But then, where should your focus be? Are you ready to focus on external relationships in your local community with the world? Or do you really need to focus your efforts and your energies internally? So if you do that, you can think already about some behaviors that you might focus on and that you might choose this or that. So if it's external, and you're overcoming weaknesses, you might focus on things like outsourcing or shared services with other institutions. If it's really internal, then you might want to reduce redundancy. You might want to collaborate more internally. You might want to improve the experience of students. You might want to focus on your institution's outcomes. Then if you're thinking about maximizing strengths versus overcoming weaknesses, here are some other behaviors that you might be led to with these 4 quadrants. Internally, you might say, we've got to get the right people at the institution doing the right things. It takes us a long time to do things. We need to do things faster. We need to focus on agility. Or we need to move in new directions, apply emerging technologies. Then externally, you can think about partnerships, new markets, things like that. So here are a couple of grand strategies for you to think about if you're focused on weaknesses or strengths, and the grand challenges that they could help you with. So the grand principle of simplification might be a principle to keep in mind if your focus is really overcoming weaknesses, and that can help you with 3 of those 4 grand challenges that I mentioned. Or you may be ready to focus on innovation, in which case they can help you with 3 of the other 4. So you think about both the grand challenges that you have, but also where your institution is best positioned. So I have broken down in great detail that looks better on your own screen than it does when you're here, especially those of you in the back row, for simplification and how to take that grand principle, work it into grand plans and then grand behaviors. But with a little closer, grand plans for simplification might be emphasizing coordination, shared goals. How do you simplify the operations, but also the user experience? How do you really focus more sharply on institutional outcome? How do you reduce redundancy? And a set of grand behaviors. These are the things that we always talk about doing, right? We're going to introduce enterprise architecture, product management, personalization, cloud, continuous improvement, data and analytics. Why? In service to what end? So having started with simplification, those are some choices you would make for simplification. These are all digital aspects of digital transformation. You can find all of these gray boxes in those articles I pointed you to. One quick data point, some change in related trends that EDUCAUSE has been tracking. These are the percentage of US institutions that have incorporated these trends into their IT strategy already. And you can see institution-wide data management and integrations, about 6 in 10 institutions. And the big changes, 6 percentage points over 2 years, it's kind of a lot. Changing enterprise architectures, workflows, integrations, and then user-centered designs. So that's where we see some action. So let's talk about innovation. We're going to address 21st century problems. More emphasis on flexibility and agility, creative strategies inspired by new technologies and greater use of data, and more emphasis on change and managing risk than on being conservative and risk aversion. Some technologies, these are very different. The grand behaviors, clearly defined transformation goals, new leadership roles in new areas, perhaps a chief digital officer, perhaps a chief student success officer, and the like. Integrating research services, making them widely available, new digital methods applied to research, AI data platforms, et cetera. Some changes in data technology that EDUCAUSE tracks, and you can see some really big changes here over just 2 years, particularly in open educational resources, big movement toward that, and big percentage changes, but still not broadly implemented in digital micro-credentials, uses of the Internet of Things for teaching and learning. So we've got our grand challenges. This is research that EDUCAUSE did based on about 200 respondents from universities, CIO respondents. We're going to be repeating that and getting chief academic officer respondents as well. These are the challenges and the potential benefits, of digital transformation that our respondents believed digital transformation can help address these opportunities. And we used our definition of digital transformation, not whatever was in their ad. So you can see from improving the student experience, expanding research, ensuring institutional survival, attracting more students, generating new income, et cetera. We also asked them, how important is digital transformation today compared to 2 years ago? And how important do you think it'll be 2 years from now? So we do believe that this is more than just a buzzword or hype, but people really think that this is something that can be important. However, today, only 13%, so just a little over 1 in 10, say that they are engaging in digital transformation right now. Another third are developing a strategy, and a little bit more than a third are exploring it. And when we looked at that 13%, so a very small sample, but when we looked at what are they doing today, these are the things they're prioritizing. The items in blue: improving the student experience, improving faculty teaching, improving students' outcomes at course level or student dropout rate, improving reputation and standing, reducing costs. So those behaviors, those plans that they're focusing on now really do align, we think, more with a grand strategy of simplification. And so we think that today's pioneers are focused on simplification. Then final thoughts very quickly. A grand strategy can help you work in the gray zone when you've got gray zone problems and challenges. And we really do today. So a grand strategy can facilitate coordinated action, because we all have a vision, not just for the outcome, but also for the plan and what we're going to do. Almost half, a little bit more than half of our CIOs say that insufficient cross-institutional planning or coordination is a major barrier to digital transformation. And a focus on grand strategy can help align the institution. What are our CIOs' hopes for 3 to 5 years for simplification? Well, they're really hoping to simplify both the back end as well as the front end user experience through standards, through apps that are as easy to use as institutional services, and also thinking about institutions directing more of their effort towards student needs, focused on student needs, student outcomes, in however broadly we define it. Takeaways for simplification: what do you really need to be able to do? You need to start breaking down the silos. And if the whole really is greater than the sum of the parts, then you need to have a whole to start with. If you don't have a whole, maybe simplification is what you need to do. Now, for a grand strategy of innovation, one of the things that we asked our institutional leaders was, do you have an innovation strategy for your institution? And they said, oh, that's a great question. Well, we're really good at those individual ideas, right, that pop up. And that's kind of where we are. And we chase shiny objects, but we really haven't been able to sustain it. We can't scale it. We're kind of moving from this highly creative, but not very deliberate, coordinated approach to something more institutional. And then a few said, we've got this. We have a strategy. We have a focus. So think about, does your institution have a strategy and a focus? What do CIOs hope for in 3 to 5 years with innovation? They really, one of the things they hope for is that institutions will start to see what they are doing with technology and with what as products.
That's when your alarm clock goes.
That's my own time. Right. So
it's a very generous alarm clock as well. But...
Thank you. That they focus on differentiating. How are we different? And how is our value add different from an education you can get anywhere else? And that we really think about how we help people thrive in life, not just at the institution. So takeaways, beware of innovation theater. Innovation theater is when you do a lot and you get people really excited. Maybe you host hackathons, or maybe you have these pilot demonstration products, but you have no way to scale. You have no approach to scale or sustainability. Think about product management. In technology, we talk about people, process, technology. Add a fourth word to that mantra: product. And so my advice to you is choose. You have to choose one, but choose wisely. I think most institutions will want to start with simplification, because if you remember our little maturity scale, many of our institutions are still somewhere in the digitization or the digitalization journey. And that work still has to proceed. And that has to be very far along, related to the outcomes you want to achieve for digital transformation. This is a little quote saying that the company Philips, started with simplification, and they built the platform that was a platform on which they could innovate sustainably and at scale. Quick example, California community colleges, 2-year colleges, they've created a course exchange, and it's 2 steps. They started with simplification, moved on to innovation. Step 1, simplification, they consolidated the online course systems across 115 campuses with individual identities, individual degree granting that served 2.1 million students And what they did was they said, let's identify the common business processes. Let's learn how to work together. And let's create one single shared online course system. Then step 2, enabled them to create the California Community College Course Exchange that enables students, no matter which of those 114 campuses they're enrolled in, to be able to take an online course for credit that's offered by any of those 114 campuses. So that's a quick example. Summary, we've got some grand challenges we have to address, and a grand strategy approach might work. We're suggesting simplification and innovation. You might come up with grand principles that are different, so I don't want you to think that these are your 2 choices, but you may find them useful. Digital transformation can then be applied to fuel the grand plans and behaviors for grand strategy. Thank you very much.
Susan, would you like to join me here?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your theoretical framework and your vision and the way you see digitalization as a tool to fix grand challenges. I found your analogy to the Cold War very daring to some extent, because in the end, the Cold War caused a lot of costs in itself. And on the other hand, the unexpected happened. The Berlin Wall came down. So to some extent, and that would be my question to you, how can grand challenges be addressed, and grand strategies can only prepare to some extent for the unexpected, but they obviously shift attention in a certain direction. And what if the direction is not the right one? How do you deal with that?
One of the competencies of higher education to date, I would say, has been that we are very, very good at admiring problems and less good at solving them. So I think that you're right, that there can be unintended outcomes, unexpected outcomes, and any choice that is made will inevitably turn away from the ability to choose other choices. Any change or choice or direction that we go in will close off other directions and will help things in some way and also perhaps deter them in other ways. We think about this a lot in the United States as we think about the higher education that we grew up with and know and love. My own brother was a rector at a university, and he grew up a mathematician and just a wonderful, wonderful master teacher. And it breaks his heart to see the institution that he retired from now change its focus. And they're focusing much more on creating degree programs for jobs, for practical skills, whether it's cybersecurity or data science or something like that. They've become more affordable. And they've done so by eliminating, in part, 20% of the faculty. It is very, very difficult to make these changes. And so what you have to think about is you have to think about whether the changes will be to a greater benefit than a cost. You have to forgive yourself for making mistakes. And at the beginning, what's the saying? To make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. And yet you also have to do that. I believe that the best leaders bring their heart as well as their head. And so how can you make difficult choices that have difficult outcomes for people with compassion? And part of that is to develop greater competencies in enterprise risk management.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions from the floor? It's late in the evening, but come on. I see one in the back. Yes?
Yes.
Two. Let's go.
Well, Susan, thanks first of all for being with us tonight and sharing your insights on these very relevant topics. We are very happy as a Hochschulforum to have you with us. And given that we are a network here and that you are representing a network membership association as well, what's your stake concerning the collaboration design in managing these challenges and maybe also getting a more joint dynamic into the game? So how do you deal with that? And maybe you could elaborate a bit more. What's the future trend on collaboration versus competition in your system?
Yes, one of the superpowers of higher education has always been how collaborative we are. And it's just a beautiful thing. And if you think about industry, industry is not very collaborative because they privilege competition and the individual outcomes over collaboration and the outcomes of the greater ecosystem. We are doing our best to be able to foster cooperation and to be able to create opportunities for cooperation. One of the things that we're doing to help advance digital transformation is starting next year, you will see our strategy for supporting digital transformation start to become quite visible. So we're starting by collecting case studies of digital transformation so that institutions can submit case studies and say, here's what we're doing with case studies. Another thing that we'll be doing is we'll be doing a digital transformation showcase toward the end of the year that we'll showcase at our annual conference, which will be in the United States in Boston next October. But we hope to be able to transform that into a competition of sorts. And one of the criteria that we will be looking for is a criteria of greater collaboration. We have a capability within EDUCAUSE called working groups. What working groups are is they are facilitation and focus of EDUCAUSE staff on a cross-institutional working group of people from different institutions who come together collectively and collaboratively to solve a common problem. And that common problem might be very small and focused, or it might be large and definitional. But these are some examples of how we're really trying to foster a collaboration. And then one last thing I'll say is that EDUCAUSE is a member of an international coalition, the Coalition for Higher Education IT Associations, and we are working with about a dozen IT associations that represent other IT associations from around the world, and trying to find ways to collaborate that way. And collaboration is very, very difficult. I will also say that.
We'll have one more questions, and then I think we'll break for the night.
Yes.
You had a question over there? No? Yes.
Just a quick remark, or maybe you could clarify on that. Several times within your talk, you mentioned that universities and higher educational institutions are concerned with providing credentials and certificates, and that is one of the most prominent goals in their strategies. I'm wondering, what about providing skills? Providing a certificate and credentials is easy. You need somebody to sign a piece of paper. That's not a challenge. A challenge is to provide actually skills, to have a learning success, not just a piece of paper.
Yes, a few things about that. In terms of digital credentials, one of the things that institutions are focused on is skill-based credentials. Whether they're micro certificates or even the phrase nano certificates. And many institutions are trying to develop competency models aligned with those skills. And very often one of the partnerships that we see our institutions doing is creating partnerships with local or regional or global employers. And identifying the skills and the competencies that those employers are looking for in their future workforce.
About the actual teaching. So how do you teach the skills? So you define which skills you expect, you organize along micro-credentials and nano-credentials, but how do you teach the skills? How do you make sure that the students actually acquire those skills that you would like to accredit?
Right, and that goes to a framework that we have developed at EDUCAUSE in collaboration with other organizations called the Next Generation Digital Learning Environment, or NGDLE. And one aspect of that framework is assessment. And so how do you really, it's not just, yes, I'm a faculty member and I'm going to teach data science or what have you. But also, how do we assess those students and how do we assess them in relation to competencies and skills? So our environment, our ecosystem is thinking about those things, I'm happy to say. They're experimenting with them. And we'll see. I'll give you one example just to show perhaps the gap between what is being taught now and the skills that employers are looking at. Duke University, which is a very well-known research institution in North Carolina in the United States. Very, very selective, as selective as Yale and Princeton and the like. Well, one of the things that they learned from talking with their students and their alumni and employers was that they were graduating their students and they had learned beautifully how to think and how to think in the context of, say, history or mathematics or psychology or something like that. But very often they didn't come ready with job-ready skills that they needed. So Duke has created a system of non-credentialed for now, but they want to be able to credential them, little micro courses that students can take online, as well as faculty, as well as employees, as well as alumni, to be able, for them to be able to say, well, I want to get a job in this. Maybe I want to get a job as a programmer, but I don't know C++, or maybe I want to get a job, and you know what? I'm not sure. I think I need to learn more about critical thinking or about influencing skills or something like that. So they take these little micro credentials as a way to bridge the gap. Now, I'm not sure that Duke has created a follow-up assessment to be able to certify this, but I think that this is an example of how our field is changing and really trying to think much, much more pragmatically.
Well, that's a nice way to finish the first day.
Yes. And I'd be happy to talk with you at the cocktail hour if you want to poke at that a little more.
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you. And let's give her a big round of applause. So we come to the end of day one. I would have loved to invite you to remain for some champagne, but instead we settled for a beer-to-peer tonight. So that's the program for tonight. We will have a dinner. There will be some music afterwards, some drinks. And then tomorrow morning, we continue with, at 9 o'clock, some coffee. And then we start for real at 9:45 on the topic Bologna Digital, right here. And the next day will be hosted by my colleague, Sebastian Sperlich. And I thank you all for your attention for this day, to stick around, to discuss with us. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you very much and see you tonight. And one logistical map, please bring your badges tomorrow so that we don't have to print them again. Thank you.